and newcomers to the South Orange Library Summer Lecture Series. Thank you all for coming today. You are going to be so happy you did, because the author of this book, Brothers at Bat, okay, when I tell you about it, it's a true story of an amazing It's the true story of an amazing all-brothers baseball team. Not only did they share their talent and love of baseball with one another, but they showed everyone how a family should be, caring, loving, and supporting one another throughout the years. It's a beautiful book, and we're so happy that the author, Audrey Vernick, is here, our very special guest, and her beautiful daughter, Anna, is here. And I know these books are written for young adults. And let me tell you something, some of the best books I've ever read are children's books and young adult books. And my director, Melissa Kopecky, said, "You're never too old for a picture book." And yeah, and anyone who reads The Giving Tree or any of your books, okay, I keep forgetting. Anyone who has ever read any books that have touched their heart and they could read it over and over again knows that that's the important thing. I love this book. And my son, who's in baseball, I called him up after I read it and I said, you have to read about what a beautiful family and how these young children, and they lived in New Jersey, came about. So I'm going to let Audrey tell you about it. And she also wrote she loved baseball, and this is also a fascinating book about a young woman fighting not only the color of her skin, but how to succeed, and she did succeed.
In New Jersey.
In New Jersey. Before I begin, I couldn't do any of these programs without the help and support of all my friends, and I call my family, my second family, all the people who work here. So I want to thank them for all their help and support. And now, let's learn all about the family, Brothers at Bat. Please, let's give a very warm welcome to our very special guest.
This is good, volume-wise? We're good? Okay. I'm guessing that it's been a while since anyone's read you a story? I'm going to read you a story. I'm going to read you the book so that we are all talking about the same thing and know what we're talking about. You'll see the pictures on the screen thanks to my lovely assistant. Okay. Brothers at Bat, and so we begin. When winter's chill melts into spring, back doors swing open and slap shut as kids just home from school run outside, mitts, bats, and balls in hand. In one New Jersey town near the ocean, back in the 1920s and 30s, you could hear the same door slam over and over. 3 brothers raced out, slap, slap, slap. Out went 3 more, slap, slap, slap. And more, slap, slap, slap. And still more, slap, slap, slap. It sounds like a fairy tale, 12 baseball-playing brothers. But Anthony, Joe, Paul, Alfred, Charlie, Jimmy, Bobby, Billy, Freddy, Eddie, Bubby, and Louie Achera were all real. They had 4 sisters, too, Catherine, Florence, Rosina, and Frances, and a white dog named Pitch. The sisters didn't play ball. Back then, most people thought sports were just for boys. The Acheras had so many kids that they slept 2 to a bed and sat 3 across in their outdoor bathroom. They ate dinner wherever they could find a seat. Even on a baseball field, there were more boys than positions, but that didn't stop them from playing. Baseball set the rhythm of their lives. Every spring, Freddy said, you would take your glove out, go in the yard, and play. Neighbors couldn't recall a time when there weren't Achera boys outside tossing the ball, hitting it hard, racing around, with the young ones watching, wishing they were old enough to play. Their high school baseball team had an Achera on it 22 years in a row. In 1938, the brothers ranged in age from 7 to 32. The oldest 9 formed their own semi-pro team and competed against other New Jersey teams. Their father coached them and never missed a game. Their uniforms all said the same thing, Acheras. The infields they played on were dirt, outfields were littered with rocks and sand. The brothers loved to talk about the day they played at the old dog track, an oceanfront stadium that had once been an auto raceway. It was there that Anthony, the oldest, hit a couple of home runs right into the Atlantic Ocean. They called Anthony Poser because of the way he'd stand at the plate, as if his baseball card photo were being taken. Charlie, the 5th oldest, was the slowest brother. He was a good player, but a terrible runner. The brothers often joked about the time he hit a ball nearly out of the park, but only made it to second. Jimmy, the sixth brother, had a knuckleball people still talk about. You couldn't hit it, Eddie said. You couldn't catch it either. That ball danced in the air. Jimmy was a great hitter, too, probably the best player on the team. But there was no jealousy, no rivalry, no fighting. As the younger brothers grew up, the older ones shared playing time. If someone dropped a fly ball or struck out, no one screamed or threw down his glove or stomped off the field. We stuck together, Freddy said. The team played around New Jersey, in New York, Connecticut, wherever they could find a good game. Paul sent out letters looking for new teams to play. The all-brother team always drew big crowds. In 1939, at the New York World's Fair, the Acheras were honored as the biggest family in New Jersey. They were taken to the Newark airport, where they boarded a plane and were flown over the fairgrounds. They couldn't believe it. No one they knew had been on a plane before. Most of the people at the World's Fair looking up at that small plane in the sky had no idea there was a whole team of brothers aboard. But it wasn't all fun and games and sunny skies. Their darkest day occurred on the field, too. Freddy was on third base in a scoreless game. Alfred was at the plate. He touched his shoulder, the signal that he was going to bunt. Then things went wrong. The pitch came in high, and somehow the ball bounced off the bat and hit Alfred hard, right in the face. They rushed him to the doctor, but he lost an eye. For the next few months, Eddie took Alfred's place as catcher. Everyone thought Alfred's baseball days were over. But when you have 11 brothers willing to throw you balls in the yard, gently at first, then a bit harder, you get your skills back. You get your courage back, too. Alfred was soon wearing the Acheras uniform again. He was a pretty good catcher for a guy with one eye, Freddy said. In the 1940s, something pulled the brothers' attention away from baseball. American soldiers were fighting in the Second World War across the Atlantic, that same huge ocean Poser hit baseballs into. Battles were raging and soldiers were dying, but the brothers knew it was important to fight for their country. The team disbanded as 6 Achera brothers joined the service. Jimmy was the first to go. He, Charlie, Eddie, and Bobby all served in the Army. After Billy joined the Marines, Freddie did too. Those 6 brothers traveled far from home. After a lifetime of talking and playing together every day, they now went months, years, without seeing one another. They longed for the salty stew smell of the Atlantic Ocean. They dreamed of their childhood home, of the back door slap, slap, slapping as they went outside to play, and of long afternoons throwing a ball in high, soaring arcs from glove to glove to glove in a field full of brothers. Back in New Jersey, their parents and siblings waited for news. It took a long time for letters to reach them from overseas. There was a lot of time to worry. When the war finally ended, everyone was so happy. Eddie, out in California with the Army, was so excited that he went up to women he didn't even know and kissed them. Many American soldiers died in World War II, but the Acheras were very lucky. One by one, all 6 brothers returned from their time in the service. Mama Achera cried each time a boy walked in the door. By the summer of 1946, the family was ready to get back to baseball. They were all older, of course, and Poser's heart had grown weak, so now he coached the team. They joined the Long Branch City Twilight Baseball League, and over the next 6 years won the league championship 4 times. Every Sunday, crowds filled the stands to watch the all-brother team play. As time passed, the Acheras got married and moved into their own homes. They worked hard at their jobs, at the water company, at the post office, selling insurance. They started having children of their own. In 1952, they played their last game as a team, but they had already made history. The Achera brothers were the longest-playing all-brother baseball team in history. In 1997, the Baseball Hall of Fame held a special ceremony to honor them. Only 7 were still alive. Paul, Alfred, Bobby, Billy, Freddie, Eddie, and Bubby all made the trip, along with more than 100 relatives, including their sister, Frances. Jimmy's son donated his father's uniform and glove, which were put on display right there in the same museum that honored Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb and Willie Mays. They treated us like we were kings, Freddie said. After such a thrilling day, you could picture them driving off into the sunset, happily ever after. But their bus broke down. They could have sat on the curb, grumbling in the summer heat, but someone found a bat and ball, and as 3 generations of Acheras waited for a new bus, they played ball. That ball soared from grandfather to granddaughter, from father to son, from brother to brother. And that's the book.
That was a beautiful, beautiful book. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I never even noticed it.
Okay, I'm going to just give you a little background on the books I've written and how I came to write this story. The talk will certainly focus more on this story. This was Bark and Tim, A True Story of Friendship, a book I wrote with my sister, who's a second grade teacher. We mentioned She Loved Baseball. That's kind of local to you. Effa Manley owned a Negro League team in the 1940s that won the 1946 Negro League World Series. She was a manager of a baseball team in the 1930s and 40s as a woman, as an African-American woman, and she fought tirelessly for civil rights. She was really quite an impressive person, you know, right over in Newark. Brothers at Bat, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with now. And then I write silly books for little kids too. This is Your Buffalo Ready for Kindergarten? Spoiler alert, he is. He's ready for kindergarten. Teach Your Buffalo to Play Drums, So You Want to Be a Rock Star, Bogart and Vinnie, a completely made-up story of true friendship. And this is my newest picture book. That's a terrible picture of my newest picture book, Edgar's Second Word, a book about the frustrations of waiting for your baby to be born when you're an older sibling. Two novels too. This is my first one, Water Balloon. We're not supposed to say it, but that's my girl book, and this is my boy book, but we would never say such things because we don't use those distinctions. And Screaming at the came out this spring. So, the Acheras. I live in Monmouth County. I live in Ocean Township in Monmouth County, and the Acheras story is a nearby story that's maybe 15 minutes from my home. In Monmouth County, I don't think it's possible to not know someone whose last name is Achera. There were 16 of those children. They all had children, and they were all having children, so everyone knows an Achera. I think it comes up later, but I gave a similar talk at the public library in Long Branch, and it was a very full house, and I said, is there anyone here who knows an Achera? And there was not a hand that did not go, literally not a hand that didn't go up. And it was a pretty full house, right? There were Acheras there, but there were a lot of people it was very interesting. So I think of it as a neighborhood story. It was a story that was there waiting to be told. The relatives of the Acheras could not be more obvious in their pride in their family's story. I knew the way I came to the story was through Rob Achera, who is the son of Bobby Achera. He lives in my town, and he would talk about his dad and his uncles who had formed this all-baseball, obviously you know it now, all-brother baseball team. My brain couldn't wrap around that. Like, how could there be enough brothers? I'd never knew a family that big in my life. And how could they all like baseball? It just seemed like the most unlikely thing I'd ever heard. I was sort of at the start of my writing career when I heard it, but it just was very intriguing, and I always wanted to know more, and I always felt like this is a story that people would like. But as I visit schools a lot, and I talk about how I do the research I do for the books I write, and you bump up against this one. How do you do research when no books have been written on this? I can't get a book about the Acheras. There was no book about the Acheras. There were newspaper articles, but they all kind of were more of box scores than anything else, and so that's exciting. They won games. And one interesting thing about the box scores, for those of you who have ever seen a box score, is they're usually by last name, but you can't really do that. So it was a whole list of first names for the Acheras box scores. But I also knew that the answer was staring me in the face. I was just kind of too shy of a person to face it. The answer was that there were 3 primary sources living in my county, and I just needed to work up my nerve to introduce myself to an absolute stranger, which, I always say to kids when I'm at a school, like, I don't know about you, but no one's ever called me and said, hi, can I come over and ask you some personal questions about your childhood and, about your family and everything that, well, you've never met me, but that'll be fine, right? I can just come over. And so I did do that, but it took me a while to work up that nerve. It's just not a natural thing for me to do. I said, I know your son. I know your nephew, Rob, so I felt like, okay, if she's a serial killer, at least Rob can find her. And I made the call, and he said something very curious. He said, okay, yeah, no, that's good. Come on Tuesday. On Tuesday, I make spaghetti. And I said, I think there's been a miscommunication. I'm definitely not looking for a dinner invitation, though thank you. I just want to come over and ask you some questions. And he said, that's great. 5 o'clock spaghetti on Tuesday. So at 5 o'clock, on Tuesday, I went for spaghetti dinner, and I think you'll love what I discovered. I found out that Freddy, who'd been widowed, I think at this point, at least 20 years, had real concern for the men in his life who had also been widowed but didn't know how to cook the way he knew how to cook. So every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of every single week of his life, he would wake up early, get in the kitchen, and start cooking, as though there was going to be this enormous party at his house. He didn't know who would come, but he knew they'd come. It would be, I'd been to maybe 3 or 4 of them, and it would be certainly, like, his brother Eddie would almost always be there, and then the craziest, most random selection of other people, like his grandson's friend that he once met 7 years ago. Hey, remember me? And then the people he worked with at the water company, and people his brothers worked with at the post office, and just this strange group of people who probably never all exactly been together in that configuration, but it felt like another kind of family. It felt like this fun, free, comfortable place where they would laugh, remember, tease each other, and it was also, on the days I was there, you know, a little bit more focused, with a tape recorder in the middle of the table and me taking notes in the corner and being told, eat more, eat more, eat more. What's the matter? Why are you not eating more? Do you not like my spaghetti? And so that's how I sort of pulled the stories from them. The first time I went, I thought, like, okay, now I got it. I'm not going back because that's overwhelming. It's lovely and wonderful, but it's a little overwhelming. But of course, anytime you ask your questions, it leads to the 20 you forgot to ask. So I did end up going a number of times with my questions, and it's a good thing I went a lot of times, because different things would come out, and sometimes you'd have, you know, they were in their 80s by the time I was interviewing them, and there were things that they'd tell me differently, different ways, you know, different times, so I knew which things I needed to be very careful about in my research, and which things I had to leave out. And one of my favorite refrains was the constant reminder, guys, this is for a children's book, because they would veer off into the testosterone stories of remember the time. And no, I mean, tell your story, it's very funny, but it's a children's book. So they would, you know, pull out their, I think this was just a photo, I don't think they had the shirt on hand, but they would pull out photos in the book, you remember, where they flew in an airplane over the World's Fair. This is them as they boarded the airplane. And I love this photo because when I picture the guys, I picture the ones toward the right, and I always forget about the little guys on the left. And it's, just look how little those little guys are on the left. So this was a really hard book to publish. Editors were like, well, no one's heard of them. You know, who's going to want to buy a book about someone no one's ever heard of? And I was like, you know, I was like, yeah, well, that's fair, but, you know, I don't know, you know, like, that's your job, you know, get the book out there and we'll see. But I was asked by one editor, would you consider fictionalizing it? That way we could add so much more, you know, drama. And I said, like, the very coolest thing about this story is the fact that it's true. I mean, you're taking away what's best about the story. I always say, like, I could have made it 38 brothers, and they could have been hippopotamus brothers if I wanted to fictionalize this book. To me, my favorite thing about this book is the fact that it's true. So that was, you know, when you're I was pretty early in my career when I was getting these rejections. You really want to get your books published. You're kind of almost willing to do anything, but that was the one thing I really wasn't willing to do, and I'm very glad I did. And it also felt disrespectful to them to change their story. So it finally did get acquired. A publisher really wanted to publish it, and as soon as the editor acquired it, she left the business. So, which is the kind of thing that happens all the time. It's happened to me 3 times, but I didn't know that it would happen all the time then. I was kind of a young writer. And it turns out that the person who came to inherit the book from her had the same passion for it. So I don't get much occasion to share this quote, but I'm going to make you listen to this quote. So this is what Cal Ripken said. I was lucky to play in the big leagues with my brother as a teammate and my dad as a manager. It was a very special time. The story of the Achara brothers brought those memories back. It is a wonderful illustration of what a great game baseball is and how it brings families together on many levels. Really? Brothers at Bat is a story any baseball fan will enjoy, and one that we all should know. So that was thrilling, but it was too late to put it on the back of the book. They were like, don't worry, this book will reprint, and we'll get it on the back when it reprints, and then they forgot. But then it reprinted a second time, and now it really is. Look, you can see it on the back of the book right here. It really did make it onto the back of the book, but it was really quite a thrilling thing. I always feel, I once read a blurb on the back of a book, and I don't remember who it was, but she wrote, if you're like me, when you read a blurb on the back of the book, you think, oh, I didn't know they knew each other. Because whenever I read a blurb on the back of a book, I'm like, oh, I didn't realize they were friends, because I think that that's how it happens in the business. But it just really touched me, especially that Cal Ripken, who doesn't know me from anyone, took the time to do that. So, okay, so this was, the book's about to come out. It's very exciting. 3 of the brothers that I knew and interviewed during it were still alive, and they were really, I had read the book to them before it was illustrated. I read them the final text. They were not crying kinds of men, but there were very wet faces around the table. Very satisfying, emotional kind of thing. And then I heard from the daughter-in-law of one of the brothers that he had said, I really want to get back to Cooperstown one more time. And it didn't include the words, before I die, but it was very clear that they were implied there. And so you know, I thought, well, this is, all right, so we can do this. So we decided to have the launch party for the book at the Baseball Hall of Fame. They called it Sibling Day, and anyone who came with their brother or sister got in for half price. We brought up, well, we didn't bring them up, they got themselves there with family. The 3 brothers who were still alive, as well as their sister, who at the time I think was 98, she's 102 now. And she made the trip, and so I had the 4 of them in the room, and I read the book, and then I interviewed the 4 of them for the people in attendance, many of whom were related to them and knew everything they'd say, but many of whom were also just there because it was Sibling Day at the Hall of Fame. So this is the crew. We have standing behind the wheelchair is Eddie, and Freddy is the one on the right. He's the one who did all the cooking. Sitting in the wheelchair is Bubby, and that's their sister named Rosina in the book, but Babe is what they called her all the time, which is a funny name for your 102-year-old sister, Babe. This is one of the things that absolutely freaked me out. You see the picture of Jimmy. He's second row down, second one in. I had not really, after the book came out, I heard from some of Jimmy's family, but I didn't have much access to information about Jimmy when I was writing it. His wife came over to me after the reading and said, that's just what he looked like when I fell in love with him. Oh, now, Stephen was working from nothing. He had very few photographs. He certainly didn't know what they looked like at different ages. He sort of put together like a family prototype and made variations on it. But that absolutely freaked me out, that that's just what Jimmy looked like when she fell in love with him. And the other thing that happened was when I read the part about Eddie kissing a woman in California, Freddy just completely could not resist interrupting and yelled out, "He still does that!" So when I visit schools, I talk about family stories. I think I mentioned that not everyone was here when I mentioned this. The 3 brothers have died since the publication of the book. They were all alive and joined us there. The last 2 who were alive died within about 7 days of each other. It just felt like once one went, the other one was soon to follow. One died right at Christmas, and I think the other one maybe January 2nd, something like that. And it was hard, and it was also really emotional to see this book being passed around at the wake. You know, people who like knew them now but didn't know them then, and it was a very interesting situation. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned their sister is still alive. But this story, you know, they were all so proud of it, and they all had different ways they wanted to get it out, the different relatives. There was someone who had shot footage of the brothers doing interviews in hope of making a documentary film. There was someone who wanted to do a feature film. You know, there's so many relatives. There's 16 of them all who have their children and grandchildren and relatives, and it just wasn't happening, which I think is probably how things usually go. You know, we all have the best intentions, and I just think I was so lucky that I came along when I came along, that I worked up the courage that I worked up, that I didn't let that keep me from making that call and reaching out and getting there, because these stories, like, they left with them. You know, I could have heard their children's versions of these stories, but if you think the brothers were exaggerated, wait till you hear their children. You know, like, they were pretty much inducted into the Hall of Fame right alongside Babe Ruth if you hear their children tell the stories. And I love their pride in it, but I wanted to get as close to primary sources, of course, as I could. So I talk a lot when I visit schools about how these stories are just around us, and we just need to like start poking the people in our lives and looking for them a little bit, because any of their relatives could have written this book. They had the access, they could have done the interviews, they could, if they don't have interesting relatives, I'm sure all of us do, but if they didn't, they could have sought out their neighbors and interviewed them as well. I mostly just consider myself really lucky that I took the time to talk to these men and find the treasures they had to share. Now, this is going to veer me off a little bit, but you know how in New Jersey everyone has their Springsteen story? Like, oh, when I moved to Monmouth County, everywhere I went, he'd been there 5 minutes before I arrived. It's like, oh, Toys R Us, oh, you just missed him, oh, you just missed him. So I had my own story, and it was actually tied to this book. But let's see, how'd this go? So I have this book also that I wrote, So You Want to Be a Rockstar. I was doing a reading of Brothers at Bat at the Barnes & Noble closest to my house. Barnes & Noble didn't want anything to do with me ever until I wrote this book for some reason. So I showed up for my reading, and when I walked in, I saw Bubby, the brother named Bubby's son, walk over to me. He said, "Oh, you got some pretty high-profile people for your reading, huh?" I said, "What?" He said, "Oh, Bruce and Patty just walked in." I said, "Oh." Now, I have a history of making a fool of myself in front of Bruce Springsteen. This is absolutely true. So I just knew I didn't have the energy to both do that and do a public reading. Because you can do one or the other. You can make a fool of yourself or you can do a reading. This reading was the first time I was reading it in front of a number of people in the family who hadn't made it to Cooperstown. I didn't want to make a fool of myself. So I said, all right. I showed my daughter the skills of stalking from afar. We went and just watched him from a distance. We were giving him his space. And then my husband arrived and I said, so, you know, he's here. And he said, well, you got to get this book signed. You have this book being sold right here. You got to get the signs. And I was like, you know, I can't. I'm just going to ramble and won't be pretty. He said, all right, do you want me to do it? And I said, could you do that? And so he did. And so he handed him the book and said, would you sign this? And he said, what is this, a how-to book? And he said, yeah, kinda. And I said, okay. And so he wrote, practice, 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 Bruce Springsteen. And it was, you know, when I showed up for my brothers at Bat Story. But the reason I shared this story is everyone has an Achera story too, where I live. I shared with Beth that I was in a really not in a great mood, and I was racing through Target and needed to get out of that store fast. And I had dropped off a copy of this book with my new chiropractor, and I, you know, explained it, and he called me. He's like, Audrey, I gotta tell you, I treated some of these brothers. Let me tell you which brothers I treated. And I had to sit there and listen to, you know, he met this one and this one's grandson and this one, he thinks he met his daughter, but he's not sure. And really, so in Monmouth County, it is simply impossible to navigate without bumping against an Achera story. I'm pretty much done with my talk about this, but I just wanted to share with you the new thing I'm working on, which is also a neighborhood story, but I like to think of Philadelphia as being in the suburbs of New Jersey, right? And so it's pretty close, right? So I claim this as a New Jersey story, even though this girl, just look at this girl. There's something in that face that I find absolutely magic. This girl, her name was Edith Houghton. She died last year, days shy of her 101st birthday. And she, at 10 years old, tried out for an all-women's team. It was before like the ones we saw in A League of Their Own. This was really, there were only 1 or 2 women's teams in the country, and it wasn't a factory team, it was just a real women's team, and it was women in their late teens and early 20s. This girl was 10. And she went and tried out, and she made the team, and she was brought on as their starting shortstop, and she was being paid to play baseball at the age of 10. And then 3 years later, at the age of 13, they had an opportunity in 1923 to tour Japan. And her mom said, yeah, okay, and sent her daughter along with this team to tour Japan. And she had this incredible life. And the team was called the Bobbies because you had to have a gimmick when you were a women's team, and they all had bobbed haircuts. So as soon as she was given her team uniform, she had to get her hair cut off in a bob because that's the price you pay for being a female athlete in 1920s. But I'm just in love with that story, and I just always tell people to look around because I feel like these stories are there and they're waiting, and I'm so glad this one's told because the pride that their relatives take in this story is really something, and it's really like an honor to be part of it. So if anyone has any questions, I will tell you all their secrets, or, you know, they told me a lot of stuff, anything you want to know. Yes?
I just wanted to comment that is just wonderful, wonderful.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for saying it. We always think you. What a wonderful, wonderful afternoon you gave all of us.
Thank you. And I really talked into the microphone, right? You could hear me. Okay. I took that seriously.
It was
Wonderful.
Yes.
Did you ever play baseball?
Do you know I'm of the generation that didn't have a chance? You know, in summer camp we played softball a little bit, but and in school we played punch ball. I think that's a Queens thing, maybe. But no, I didn't. My dad played baseball. My husband played baseball. They both played through college, and my dad played in the Army during the Korean War. But not me. I watch a lot, though.
Most of the family plays that.
Most of the family,
I
yes.
just wanted, because of Dottie's question, my daughter plays softball. She's a real good player. They went to Shea Stadium. They was invited. But we had different little girls on the team, and we would say, Sherry, steal the base, steal the base. Picked up the pillow and ran to the next base. And then we put the manager's daughter out in the outfield because she just liked to watch the play.
Wow.
Thank you.
You are phenomenal.
Oh, thank you.
Not only your book, but the way you presented it. We
That
learned
was
so
right.
much.
Right.
Didn't we learned an awful lot about the writing craft and about how your family shared with you while you were doing all this.
Yes, yes. They all came to Cooperstown with me, by the way. Yes.
Question.
Was there any member of the family that was more difficult
to draw out or to get?
Yeah, Eddie didn't talk much. You know, like he would like let out like a little. Really, I worked with Eddie and Freddy. Bubby like just sort of was a little bit. He was harder to access until farther along, but Freddy could talk. You know, Freddy could talk. If you look at the book more carefully, you'll see almost all the quotes are from Freddy. But the information, yeah, Eddie didn't, you know, I feel so bad that I got to them when they were in their 80s because there was so much they wish they remembered that they didn't. And the interview I have access to for that woman, Edith Houghton, was done when she was 78, and her repeated refrain is, I wish you asked me this a long time ago, because she just lost so much of it. And of course she did. You know, we were asking her about when she was 10 and 13.
And what was your primary source around which you built this?
It really was questions from Freddy and pieces, newspaper articles from the Hall of Fame. They keep a file on people. So they had a file on Edith Houghton. They had a file on the Achera brothers. In fact, the way I found Edith Houghton's story, when I got the file on the brothers, it included, believe it or not, there were 29 all-brother baseball teams. That seems impossible. But some of them were sort of stretched out with cousins and things like that. And when he gave me that, he mentioned that there was one all-sister softball team. So once this book came out, I went back to him and said, remember that all-sister softball team? I need that. That's like my follow-up to this book. I need to know that story. And he couldn't find it. And he said, but do you know about the Bobbies? And that's what led me to Edith's story. Yes?
Did they ever make a documentary on this?
The footage exists, and there's a filmmaker grandson, but I don't know what he's doing. He was the one who felt a little bit the most like I was stepping on his feet a little bit, but I did get his blessing before I did it. Because I didn't want to, you know, I feel like it's their story to tell if they want to, but I didn't want them to not do it, which was what had happened for, you know, many years. So I know that they interviewed at least 3 of the brothers. Well, you know what, if you go, I don't know if you're the kind of person who goes on YouTube, but if you go on YouTube, all right, perfect. I put up a little snippet of video of them playing in Long Branch, and there's this maybe like 10-second stretch of them being really goofy together too that I just adore. That they're just, you sort of get their relationship from the way they're pouring water on each other's heads, and yeah, there's not a lot. Yes, I'm sorry, Beth.
You already answered the question. How long did it take from start to finish?
A really, really long time. And it had a different title that I still prefer, which was My Brother's Up. Because whenever anyone was up, it was My Brother's Up. But they thought, you know, that, are you laughing back there? They said, you know, we think it sounds like a kid whose brother keeps waking up in the night, so we can't call it that. So it couldn't be called that. But many years, many years. And it really had a very hard time finding a publishing home. So that was some of the years, too, in a way, with revision along the way. And I would guess like 4 or 5 years. And that's not even counting the time from when it was acquired to when it was published. Yes?
When you were talking to them, like, over spaghetti dinner, were you just trying to memorize everything?
I had a tape recorder,
You did.
and I also took notes.
So they were comfortable with
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. They were, there was
I find it really hard if somebody doesn't want to be recorded to, and when you don't, writing notes is worse when you're talking to them.
Right, but you'd have to. I mean, if you wanted to use any quotes, you'd have to do that. Yeah, no, I couldn't imagine not having the recordings. Yes?
I'm full of them. Who published, number one, who published your book? Number two, when somebody is writing a book, to which publisher do they know they should go? I mean, are there publishers just for sports? And if it's just for children, do they have a list of, I'm sure they have a list of children's publishers. Are they categorized? I mean, what did you do when you...
I have an agent, but we worked together, and I had this book out. I've had 2 agents, and my first agent tried and failed to sell this. My second agent did sell it. It was sold to Clarion, which is part of Harcourt, Houghton, Mifflin, and they're pretty good with the school and library people, and this is kind of a school and library subject. They do very well with nonfiction picture books, but there's a number of publishers who do. For some reason that nobody can understand, baseball picture books do well in a way that other sport picture books, like there's by far the most about baseball, I believe, or at least the most successful ones. I think it's a sport that lends itself well to literature somehow. I think there's room in the sport for that kind of thing. But it's my agent's job kind of to know that. Marietta could speak to that if she wanted to.
So it would seem that And getting an agent would be the best way to go.
It would, but there's that cyclical thing where it's much easier to get an agent if you've been published. So, welcome to the world.
Well, I'm
Okay.
going to tell you something.
One more.
Yes.
Besides the filmmaker grandson, everybody else was open to you doing this. You didn't have people.
Oh yeah, they were excited by it, and you know, it was also, again, I wasn't very well published at the time, so I knew it was a very long shot kind of thing. You know, they're giving me all their time and all their information and their hope, and it, you know, there's an enormous responsibility when you're writing nonfiction, you know, to the subjects you're writing about, in a way that is completely different from writing fiction. It's this, you know, you fall in love with your characters, but they're not real, and so yeah, there was just that one brother, I don't know what he is. He wasn't one of the brothers, but a nephew or grandson or something who had a moment when he wasn't at his best, let's just say. But then he did indeed, and he was the only one. But like I said, I had trouble finding them. They were like, they came out of the woodwork once the book came out, but they were hard to find when I was doing research. So
Another part of the question, did they have family albums of photos?
Not that they were willing to part with it. The sister who's alive had self-published a book about her life.
Right.
They wouldn't let it out of the house. So it was before iPhone, so I was like hand copying it and writing notes from it. And there were photos in that. That's what the airplane photos from. But you know, those photographs were divided among 16 children, and I had access to these 3.
With your new books, do you have the same illustrator?
Oh no, I've only had the same illustrator on 2 of my books. I have 10 books. So yeah, and I have 4 or 5 different publishers. So it's it's all over the place. It's hard. Yeah, especially with picture books, they just you can sometimes, when you're lucky, write them quickly, and they don't publish that many by one author in a year at a particular house. So I sort of had to spread them out a little. Yes.
I promise you this is my last question. When it comes to illustration, do you have a choice? Do you go after a specific illustrator?
The writer has very little control over the illustrator, which drives some people crazy. You know, if you have a particular vision for your book, I don't write like that. I'm not a very visual thinker, but the people who are, and that's a lot of people who write picture books, it's a very hard control issue for them. It becomes a sort of joint venture. The way when a movie is sold, a novel is sold to the movies, it's transformed enormously and the writer has to let go of it. It's a similar thing. I've been really lucky that I've let go and beautiful things have happened. So I do have a relationship with my editors at this point where most will ask me, like, what do you think of this one? Some of them only want me to say I like it, and so I do, but the ones who I can tell will take a candid answer. We can work together and come up with something. Although I'll be honest with you, this is embarrassing, but when I looked at Stephen's other work, I didn't see it. I didn't see that it would be perfect and absolutely perfect. So I also know, don't rely on your own gut. This editor does this for a living. She has a reason for thinking it. I just didn't, I mean, I can't imagine this book illustrated by someone else, and yet when she told me, I wasn't thrilled.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can't thank you. With all your other books. And your daughter, I know Anna is going to be a writer too. I just see it. Good luck to you. And you're wonderful.
Thank
because
you.
not only did you tell the story, but you told it in such a warm, loving way. And when people read something like that, it's heartwarming to know that not only were they like that then, but the uncle who was still making pasta for strangers. You have to be impressed, and you have to say to yourself, isn't that the ideal family? Isn't that the way everyone would like to know the people or be one of those people? So thank you for bringing that out. And please join us for refreshments and then enjoy the shore again.
IKEA and then the shore.
Oh,
Get up this way.
okay,
That's the
okay.
plan.
That's the wonderful part about living down the shore. She always sees the ocean. Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Bye-bye.
I don't know what normal. I grew up in Queens. My husband's family's from Philadelphia.